The British Army officer had seen elite soldiers from 32 nations come through Wales: Americans, Australians, Gurkhas, French Foreign Legion, Russian Spetsnaz. He had watched them all struggle through the same frozen mountains, the same mud-soaked valleys, the same merciless 51 hours of continuous movement. He had never once been surprised. That was about to change. When the 8 Filipino soldiers from the 1st Scout Ranger Regiment stepped off their transport in October 2019, wearing older gear than most teams and carrying equipment that raised more than a few eyebrows among international observers, the British assessment officer glanced at their kit, made a note on his clipboard, and moved on. They were from the Philippines, a Southeast Asian jungle nation. The Cambrian mountains of mid-Wales were nothing like where these men came from. Nobody expected them to be a factor. What happened over the next 2 days would silence every doubt, stun the British military establishment, and send a message to every special operations force on the planet that could not be ignored. The Filipino Scout Rangers had arrived, and they had not come to participate. They had come to win. The Cambrian Patrol is not a competition that forgives. Since 1959, the British Army has used the rugged terrain of the Cambrian Mountains in Wales as the proving ground for what it calls the world's most demanding military patrolling exercise. Every October, the hills swallow teams whole. Elite soldiers from the most powerful militaries on Earth arrive with cutting-edge equipment, months of preparation, and the absolute certainty that their training has prepared them for anything. Most of them are humbled within the first 12 hours. The exercise is not a race. It is a 60-kilometer endurance test that unfolds over 51 continuous hours, with teams moving through steep elevation changes, freezing river crossings, and zero-visibility terrain in complete darkness. Along the route, they face 16 separate military challenges, each one designed to test a specific skill under conditions of maximum physical and mental exhaustion. Chemical and biological warfare drills require teams to don full protective suits and gas masks while completing tactical movements. Casualty evacuation scenarios demand that soldiers carry a wounded teammate across broken ground while absorbing simulated enemy contact. Intelligence gathering exercises test the ability to think clearly when the body is screaming for rest. River crossings in waters cold enough to cause muscle failure are mandatory. There are no shortcuts and no second chances. British Army assessors shadow every team, watching everything, grading every decision. A wrong turn costs points. A missed checkpoint means failure. Giving up means going home with nothing. Dozens of nations send their best soldiers every year. Only a handful walk away with a medal. Gold is nearly mythical. It has been awarded to only a few teams in the event's 60-year history. Silver is the standard of the exceptional. And yet, for most of the international military community, the name Philippines did not appear in the pre-competition conversation. They were not mentioned in the assessment briefings. They were not on the radar of the teams training in Colorado mountain ranges, Scottish highlands, or the forests of Germany. They were, to most observers, the team from a small island nation that had never competed at Cambrian Patrol before 2017. That perception was about to be dismantled completely.
The Philippine Scout Rangers are among the oldest and most battle-tested special forces units in Asia. Formed in 1950 during the Philippine Huk Rebellion, a communist insurgency that threatened to collapse the young Philippine Republic, the Scout Rangers were created specifically to fight in the kind of environments that broke conventional military units. They learned early that the jungle was not an obstacle, it was a weapon. By living in it, moving through it, and disappearing into it, they could defeat forces far larger than their own. Over 7 decades, that founding philosophy shaped everything. Scout Rangers have operated continuously in active combat zones across Mindanao, Sulu, and the Visayas, fighting insurgencies, dismantling armed groups, and conducting operations in some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. They are not training soldiers, they are combat soldiers who happen to also train. The distinction matters enormously. Their selection process is ruthless. Candidates from across the Philippine Army compete in a domestic trial that mirrors the Cambrian Patrol format, with units from the Special Forces Regiment, the Light Reaction Regiment, and other elite formations all fighting for 8 spots on the international team. Only the best of the best get through. The 8 men who were selected for the 2019 Cambrian Patrol had already proven themselves in 2 wars, the competition at home and the real thing on the ground in Mindanao. They arrived in Wales carrying that history on their shoulders, even if nobody on the outside knew it yet. The team was led by First Lieutenant Michael Jungo, a young officer whose calm demeanor gave little indication of what he was capable of in the field. He was flanked by Sergeants Ramiro Sadava, Francis Ray Patches, and Emmanuel Cabaron, experienced non-commissioned officers who had spent years operating in environments where a mistake meant real consequences, not a lower score on a training evaluation. Corporals Rico Gundao, Alexander Paringpong Jr., Felipe Nebre, and Jojen Gastar completed the 8-man unit. Together, they formed a team that communicated in shorthand, trusted each other without explanation, and had already been tested in ways that no competition could fully replicate. When they arrived in Wales 2 weeks before the competition, the first thing that struck them was the cold. The Philippines is a tropical archipelago. Humidity hangs in the air like a second skin. Temperatures in Mindanao rarely drop below 20 degrees Celsius, even at altitude. The Cambrian Mountains were something else entirely. 3 degrees Celsius at dawn, wind that cut through layers of clothing, ground that was slick with frost in the early morning and turned to thick mud by midday. There were no trees to read, no familiar bird calls, no jungle canopy to navigate by, just exposed hillsides, rocky ridgelines, and gray Welsh sky stretching in every direction. Most of the other competing teams had been training in similar conditions for months. The Americans had prepared in the mountains of Colorado. The European teams had the home advantage of cold weather terrain. The British soldiers who competed were practically running on their own turf. The Filipinos had 2 weeks to adapt, 2 weeks to learn a landscape they had never seen, 2 weeks to prepare for 51 hours of continuous movement in conditions that were as foreign to them as a jungle would be to a soldier raised in Aberdeen. They used every minute of those 2 weeks. They studied the terrain. They trained in the cold with the same obsessive attention to detail that had been drilled into them through years of jungle operations. And they did something that no amount of equipment or preparation could replace. They leaned on each other. In Filipino military culture, the unit is not a collection of individuals. It is a single organism. When one man struggles, the team absorbs his burden without a word. When one man's feet are destroyed by blisters, someone else carries part of his load. The concept of bayanihan, communal unity, the Filipino cultural practice of neighbors helping neighbors, does not stay behind when Scout Rangers go to war. It travels with them, invisible in their kit, present in every decision they make. That cultural foundation would prove to be one of the most decisive factors of the entire competition.
October 14th, 2019. Before sunrise and a temperature hovering just above freezing, 140 teams from 32 nations formed up at the start point. The sheer scale of the competition was impressive. Armies from across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific all represented, every team carrying the weight of national pride alongside their 32 kilograms of equipment. The Filipino team stood in line alongside American Rangers, British Paras, and Australian infantry. They were shorter than most. Their equipment was older than most. Their cold weather gear was not the latest generation. By every external measure, they looked like a team that was there to gain experience rather than to threaten the medal positions. The British assessment officer checked his list, noted the Philippine contingent, and moved on. The horn sounded. 140 teams moved into the Cambrian Mountains, and the Filipino Scout Rangers began to do what they do. The opening hours of the exercise separated teams into rough groupings based on pace, navigation ability, and physical conditioning. Moving 60 kilometers of mountain terrain while carrying heavy loads requires a very specific kind of endurance. Not the explosive power of a sprinter, but the grinding, relentless forward movement of a machine that does not acknowledge the concept of stopping. Scout Ranger training produces exactly this. In the jungles of Mindanao, a patrol might move for 18 hours straight through terrain that chews through lesser soldiers within 3. The Rangers do not think about how far they have gone or how far they have to go. They think about the next step, then the next one, constantly forward. In the cold Welsh mountains, that same mindset transferred perfectly. The terrain was different. The principle was identical. The first major challenge point arrived in the early hours of the exercise, chemical warfare drills requiring teams to don full protective suits and gas masks and execute tactical movements under simulated threat conditions. In tropical heat, this is already exhausting. In the cold Welsh morning, with sweat-soaked uniforms from hours of mountain movement, the protective suits became miniature ovens. Teams slowed dramatically. Some soldiers began cramping from the combination of physical exertion and restricted breathing through gas masks. The Filipinos moved through the drill with a speed and efficiency that caught the British assessors' attention. They had trained in chemical drills in Philippine heat and humidity, where the physical burden of protective equipment is amplified by 38-degree temperatures. In the comparative cool of Wales, the drill felt different, harder in some ways because of the cold, easier in others because of the temperature reduction. The assessors made notes. The Filipinos were not slowing down where other teams were. The next phase of the challenge pushed into the night. Navigation in total darkness across unfamiliar mountain terrain is where many teams unravel. GPS devices were not permitted for primary navigation. Teams relied on compasses, maps, and the ability to read terrain in conditions of zero visibility. For units that trained in well-mapped, GPS-dependent environments, losing the technological crutch at night created genuine confusion. Missed landmarks, miscalculated distances, and the simple disorientation that comes with exhaustion all combined to cost teams time and points. For the Scout Rangers, night navigation in difficult terrain was not a weakness to be managed. It was a core skill developed over years of jungle operations, where triple canopy forest blocks satellite signals and technology fails routinely. Filipino special forces learned to read terrain the way other soldiers read maps, by feel, by instinct, by the accumulated memory of thousands of hours spent moving in darkness. The mountains of Wales were not the jungle, but the skill of trusting your training over your panic transferred perfectly. The Filipinos hit every checkpoint, not approximately, precisely.
The Casualty Evacuation Challenge is where the Filipino team's experience in real combat operations began to show itself in unmistakable ways. In the exercise, a team member is designated as a simulated casualty and must be treated under fire conditions, then physically carried or transported to a medical extraction point while the team maintains tactical movement. For most competing teams, this drill is an exercise in improvisation. How do you move quickly with a man down when you are already exhausted? For the Scout Rangers, it was something closer to muscle memory. Several members of the 2019 team had participated in actual casualty evacuations in Mindanao, where wounded soldiers had to be carried through dense jungle, across rivers, and over broken ground while active threats remained in the area. In those situations, there were no evaluators watching on clipboards. There were no points being awarded. There was only the weight of a brother in your arms and the knowledge that stopping was not an option. When the exercise evaluators observed the Filipino team handle the Casualty Evacuation Challenge, they saw a team that moved with unusual smoothness, not performing a drill, but executing a procedure they had done before under conditions that made a training exercise feel almost calm by comparison. The assessors stopped writing and started watching.
By the halfway mark of the exercise, approximately 24 hours of continuous movement with no sleep, burning feet, and bodies operating well past the threshold where most people's minds begin suggesting alternatives, the Filipino team was exactly where it needed to be, on schedule, not ahead, not behind, but precisely calibrated. In Cambrian Patrol, maintaining pace while managing every other variable is itself an achievement. Teams that push too hard burn out before the finish. Teams that hold back too much fall behind the time requirements. The Scout Rangers moved like a unit that had calculated its limits with precision and was refusing to exceed them in either direction. The assessors began comparing notes. Who are these Filipinos? The water crossing challenge at the 30-hour mark broke a significant number of teams. The river in question was fed by Welsh mountain runoff, water cold enough to induce involuntary muscle responses on contact. Teams that entered unprepared lost fine motor control within minutes, dropped equipment, and in some cases had to be assisted by safety personnel positioned along the bank. The Filipino team had never trained in water this cold. Their operational environment in the Philippines is warm, even in highland river crossings. By the time they reached this challenge, they had been operating continuously for 30 hours in conditions their bodies were not acclimatized to from childhood. And yet they crossed with a discipline and efficiency that the safety personnel on the riverbank described afterward as remarkable. They formed a human chain without being told to. They kept their weapons and communications equipment dry through a system of passing that spoke to team cohesion built through years of working together rather than weeks of pre-competition training. They emerged on the far bank, cold, shaking slightly, and still moving forward. The safety team stood ready to intervene. They did not need to. In the final 12 hours of the exercise, the stretch where champions are made or where even excellent teams collapse, the Scout Rangers pulled on something that no amount of physical training alone can produce. Combat veterans carry with them a frame of reference that is unavailable to soldiers whose worst experience has been a hard training cycle. When your legs have nothing left and your mind is telling you that this is the absolute limit of what is humanly possible, the memory of a real situation that was genuinely worse provides a perspective that recalibrates everything. Some of the men on the 2019 Cambrian Patrol team had served in operations during the 2017 Marawi siege, 5 months of continuous urban warfare in which Filipino soldiers fought room by room through a city against a determined and heavily armed enemy. They had gone days without meaningful rest under actual threat. They had seen real loss. Cambrian Patrol was brutal. It was not Marawi. That knowledge, carried quietly by men who did not speak of it to the assessors or to the other teams, provided a kind of fuel that cold mountains could not extinguish. The close combat challenge in the final hours of the exercise was, by the accounts of those who observed it, the moment the Filipino performance shifted from impressive to extraordinary. Teams at hour 42 are not at their best. Judgment is impaired by sleep deprivation. Fine motor skills are degraded by sustained physical output. The tactical precision that a unit might demonstrate in training becomes blunt and ragged when pushed past the threshold of reasonable endurance. Most teams at this point were moving through the challenge, completing it, earning their points, but visibly struggling with the precision required. The Scout Rangers moved through the close combat exercise with the mechanical smoothness of men who had performed these actions 10,000 times, because they had. Not in a training facility with proper lighting and rest between repetitions, in the field, in the dark, in the jungle, under conditions that made whales feel, by comparison, like a controlled environment. Their muscle memory did not require conscious attention to execute, it simply ran. The British assessors, many of whom had seen every variation of international military performance that the Cambrian Patrol could produce over decades of evaluations, were no longer making notes. They were watching. At the end of 51 hours of continuous movement, the 8 Filipino Scout Rangers crossed the finish line as a unit, every man accounted for, every piece of equipment present, every checkpoint on the route completed with precision. Not one man had needed to be assisted, not one had fallen behind.
They had moved through 60 kilometers of Welsh Naughton terrain, completed 16 military challenges, navigated in total darkness, crossed freezing rivers, performed chemical warfare drills, conducted casualty evacuations, and executed close combat exercises. All of it in an environment they had never trained in, using equipment older than most of the teams around them, with 2 weeks of preparation against months or years of equivalent training by their competition. The awards ceremony was held 3 days later. 140 teams stood in formation on the Welsh training ground. The majority received participation certificates, a recognition of completion rather than distinction. The bronze medalists were announced, solid teams, well prepared, deserving of their recognition. Then the silver medalists. When the announcer read the name of the Philippine Scout Rangers, the reaction from the assembled international military contingent was the kind that follows a result nobody had predicted. Not surprise that was polite or diplomatic. Genuine, wide-eyed, head-shaking disbelief. Only Nepal had bested them for the gold that year. Every other nation, the Americans, the British, the Australians, the Europeans, the Asians with far greater defense budgets and longer histories of competing at this specific event, had placed behind 8 Filipino soldiers in older boots who had arrived in Wales 2 weeks before with nothing but their training and each other. The British officers who greeted them after the ceremony asked the questions that had been forming since the 42nd hour of the exercise. How? The answer First Lieutenant Jungo gave in the post-competition interview went through military circles with the speed of something true and simple that people had been waiting to hear confirmed. He said that Scout Rangers had been fighting in their own country for 70 years, that they had faced every kind of challenge, survived with nothing, and won battles they had no right to win. That this was in their blood, that the cold was hard and the mountains were hard, but Scout Rangers do not know how to quit. Those words were not bravado. They were a statement of institutional fact from a man who had spent his career inside an organization built on 70 years of unbroken combat experience. The British military, to its considerable credit, received that answer with the respect it deserved. Several British officers requested conversations with the Filipino team about training methodology in the days that followed. International military observers, who had been skeptical at the start, were now asking to be briefed on Scout Ranger selection and preparation. The students, as has happened before in Filipino military history, had become the teachers. The significance of what happened in Wales in October 2019 cannot be understood in isolation. It was not simply one good performance by one good team. It was a confirmation of a pattern that runs through decades of Filipino military history, the pattern of showing up with less than expected and delivering more than anyone predicted. In 1951, 900 Filipino soldiers at the Battle of Yultong held against 40,000 Chinese troops during the Korean War, absorbing wave after wave of assault and maintaining a line that protected an entire American division from encirclement. In 1992, Filipino NAVSOG operators walked through the security perimeter of U.S. Navy SEALs during a joint jungle exercise in the Sierra Madre and whispered 2 words, "You're dead," changing American Special Operations training doctrine permanently. In 2017, a Filipino sniper known only as Corporal Mike ended the 5-month siege of Marawi with a single shot at 800 meters in total darkness, taking down the leaders of a militant group that had turned a city of 200,000 people into a war zone. In 2019, 8 Scout Rangers took silver at the Cambrian Patrol, second in the world out of 140 teams. These are not coincidences. They are the output of an institution shaped by necessity, sustained by culture, and forged in 7 decades of unbroken operational experience in the most demanding environments that Southeast Asia can produce. The Philippines does not have the largest military budget in the region. Its soldiers do not train with the newest technology or the most advanced equipment.
What they have is something that cannot be purchased or reverse engineered, a national military tradition built on the understanding that the mission is real, the terrain is unforgiving, and going home without completing the objective is not an option that the unit accepts. 4 years after the 2019 result, the Philippine Army sent another Scout Ranger team to the Cambrian Patrol in 2023. The same Lieutenant Jungo led the team again. The result was the same: silver medal, second in the world, behind only one team out of more than 170 competing units from nations across the globe. 2 silvers in 2 attempts. Not a fluke. Not luck, a standard. When an organization achieves a result once, it can be explained away. When it repeats the result under different conditions, with different personnel, against a larger field, it becomes something else. It becomes a demonstration of what that organization is, consistently, reliably, across years and circumstances. The international military community has taken note. Since the 2019 performance, requests for joint training with Philippine Scout Rangers have increased from multiple allied militaries. The Australian Army has specifically sought cooperation on jungle warfare training. American Special Operations units continue to train alongside Scout Rangers in Mindanao, and by multiple accounts, those joint exercises have influenced American training doctrine in ways that echo the NAVSOG jungle warfare experience of 1992. The British military, which hosts the Cambrian Patrol and evaluates every team that enters its mountains, now speaks about the Philippine performance with a directness that reflects the results on the scoreboard. The Scout Rangers are not an anomaly to be explained. They are a benchmark to be understood.
The 8 men of the 2019 team have moved through the ranks of the Philippine Army in the years since Wales. Some have become instructors, passing the same relentless standards to the next generation of Scout Rangers. Some have continued operational service in Mindanao, where the missions are real and the consequences of failure are not measured in competition points. All of them carry something from those 51 hours in the Cambrian Mountains. Not the silver medal itself, though it was earned and deserved, but the confirmed knowledge that what they had been built to do works anywhere, not just in the Philippine jungle, not just in the familiar environments where Scout Rangers have operated since 1950, anywhere, against anyone. When you train the way they train, when your frame of reference is built from real operations rather than simulated ones, when your unit culture demands that no man is left behind and no challenge is acknowledged as impossible, when all of that is in place, a cold mountain in Wales is just another terrain feature. The British commanders did not expect what they got. They expected a capable team from a developing military, doing its best in unfamiliar conditions, gaining valuable experience for future competitions. They got something they had not factored into any assessment. They got a team that had been training for war for 70 years and happens to be competing in their exercise that October. The mountains of Wales are still there. The same slopes, the same freezing rivers, the same darkness that swallows teams at the 24-hour mark when the body is pushing past what the mind wants to accept. And somewhere in the Philippines, the next Scout Ranger team is already preparing. They will not have the newest equipment. They will not have months of preparation in Welsh terrain. They will arrive with older gear and fewer resources than most of the teams around them. And they will do exactly what the 2019 team did. They will move through 51 hours of cold Welsh mountains without stopping, without complaining, without leaving a single man behind. They will hit every checkpoint. They will complete every challenge. And when the results are announced, the world will be surprised again, though perhaps by now they should not be. That is what the British commanders did not expect. Not just a silver medal, not just second place out of 140 teams. They did not expect to watch 8 Filipino soldiers, outnumbered by nations with larger budgets, out-equipped by teams with newer gear, out-prepared by competitors with months of environment-specific training, perform with the precision, cohesion, and endurance of a unit that had spent its entire existence being tested by something harder than any competition could manufacture. They did not expect to watch jungle fighters become mountain fighters in 2 weeks. They did not expect Bayanihan to show up on a Welsh hillside at 3 in the morning, invisible in the cold, operating as a single living thing that refused to fracture. They did not expect, when they handed out that silver medal, to be looking at men who had already won the harder version of this test, on ground where the stakes were not a score on a British Army assessment sheet, but the lives of the soldiers standing next to them. But that is who walked into the Cambrian Mountains that October. That is who walked out, the Philippine Scout Rangers. And the mountains didn't break them. Nothing ever has.